Well, welcome to tonight's Tuesday night Bible study. I don't really have a title for this. It's the history of going from about the time of Alexander the Great to the rulers even after the Crucifixion. And a lot of this was based on a book that I'd read by Dr. Miles Jones called Sons of Zion versus the Sons of Greece. And I think back to, if you have a conversation with someone and they ever say something like the Jews killed Jesus, I think reading a book like this that goes through the history of all that transpired in the centuries before the crucifixion and the conflicts that occurred after the resurrection helps give a better understanding of exactly what the children of Israel that were keeping Torah and trying to be close in a covenant relationship with God, the struggle and what was going on there. And without that knowledge, everything just kind of gets blurred in the New Testament, in the Brit Kadashah. So we're going to start this sort of look at history, starting with the time of about 393 BC. And at that time, Philip was the youngest son of King Amyntas of Macedonia. And when the king dies, he dies shortly after discovering his son-in-law, Ptolemy, was in bed with his wife, Eurydice. And Ptolemy tried to seize the throne, but it ended up falling on the eldest son, Alexander II. And in true Macedonian style, the Ptolemy has him killed, has him assassinated, and marries Eurydice. And then the youngest son, the younger son, the middle son, Perdiccas, is still a minor, so Ptolemy becomes the regent. He's basically ruling the country at this time. Back in those days, in order to bring a conflict or to keep conflict from arising, they frequently would sell somebody into hostage, as a hostage. Now, this isn't a slave, but they go and live in this other region, in this other city-state, in this other country, kind of as a bargaining chip. So at that time, Philip, the youngest son, was sold to a general a powerful general in nearby Thebes, and he was age 15 at the time. And while he was there, he became a student of Greek culture, of Greek military. He was living with this general and became proficient in military tactics. He stayed there for 3 years, and at that time, his older brother becomes of age, and the older brother has Ptolemy assassinated, and then brings his brother Philip home. And when Philip gets home, his brother Perdiccas puts him in charge of the military training, military recruitment, and then shortly thereafter, the older brother decides to invade a nearby country. He doesn't have any military experience. He's not like Philip, and he is killed in battle, his first battle. And so then Philip becomes king. He ascends to the throne. The year right now is 359 BC. So then, seems to be the style there in Macedonia, he has his half-brother arrested and murdered, Archelaus. And then what Philip does is he gathers every able-bodied man in the country, and they go and they attack, their surrounding neighbors, Illyria, and he becomes victorious, and at the age of 23, becomes the hero of Macedonia. And over the next 20 years, they continue to have military campaigns and going and conquering other places. When Philip took over the army, one thing they did, and I'm not really I don't have any military background. I'm not a student of military science or anything like that. But if you've seen some of these movies, they show these warriors with these 12 and 14-foot spears, and it was Philip that first used that. And so they would use these long spears, and as the cavalry was charging towards them, they couldn't get to them. And so they became known as the Foot Companions, and they were the most skilled fighting force the world had ever seen. And so their victories were just almost too numerous to count. So over the next 20 years, they just start conquering region by region by region. And this went on for a period of time. It said that Philip would get a new wife with every new military campaign, just add another one to it. The Macedonian and the Greek attitude towards marriage was not like ours. There were not these romantic overtones that we have today. They saw it as a way to create an alliance or a way to accumulate power. And it was the most widely used mechanism to gain power other than assassination. Philip marries Myrtilles, who then took the name of Olympias, and she was said to be beautiful, bloody-minded, manipulative, and she was the princess of a mystery cult, and she was the mother of Alexander the Great. Now, the reason it's a mystery cult is not just anybody could join it; you had to be initiated into it. I've read that there were snakes involved in their rituals. She even is written to have slept and had snakes sleeping with her in her bed. So, really strange, peculiar. So, over the next 20 years, they start conquering all their neighbors. But Athens and Thebes decides to band together to try to stop Macedon from taking them over. And they met in this great battle. The Athenian line had over 30,000 men. It was a mile long. And at the end of it, it was anchored by a famous band of thieves. They were soldiers that were known throughout the world for being very feared and skilled. And so Philip takes his 18-year-old son Alexander to take his men and put them in charge of the cavalry right in front of the sacred band, which is quite an incredible post for such a young man. Of course, they're victorious. Alexander learns the military techniques of how to go in and conquer and attack at their strongest point, not their weakest point. That was the best way to achieve a military victory. And their victories were phenomenal. They hardly ever lost. They were victorious. They won that battle. And so Philip sends Alexander to Athens in order to negotiate terms of peace. And they gave very favorable terms to Athens. Athens was able to keep most of their territory. And so when they saw that it was such favorable terms, they quickly ratified the terms. And then they made Philip the hegemon, which is the military leader, and they formed the Pan-Hellenic League. So if you hear somebody talk about someone being Hellenized, that's just sort of a fancy term for being indoctrinated into the Greek culture and the Greek pagan gods and their whole way of life. So the next thing that happens is Philip has a falling out with his wife Olympia. He divorces her for adultery, and he said he wanted to remarry and sire a legitimate heir. So therefore, insinuating that Alexander was not his son, and he was a bastard. So at an upcoming wedding feast of their daughter Cleopatra, Philip is assassinated by an aggrieved male lover, Pausanias, and then immediately Alexander had trusted men there that then kills the assassin. Then they had horses waiting and they escaped, and a couple of them are executed for murder. But historians say, and it appears that Alexander and his mother Olympia successfully had a successful coup. It's also written that Alexander was told by his mother that they were descendants from Achilles and that they had the blood of gods running through them. And think it was Josephus that wrote that he believed he couldn't be killed, that he was immortal. So, he was fearless in battle, and so were his men. So what he did is then he took the power and the army that he had taken from his father and became the emperor of the known world. He was even more successful in his military campaigns than anyone else in history at that time. He goes over to Asia Minor. He defeats Darius there, and starts taking all the harbor cities along the way. Darius escapes with his life, but his army that he had with him was completely demolished, and he escaped, leaving even his wife and his family there. But they would fight on the battlefield another day. Next, Alexander and his army they march through Phoenicia towards Jerusalem, and Josephus writes that Simon HaSadiq, or Simon the Just, walked all the way through the night in order to meet Alexander before he got to Jerusalem. And when he meets up with him, he shows him the scriptures, and he shows him this passage in Daniel where it talks about this great general, this king is going to conquer have great victories and conquer the world. We'll read it here in just a minute. He convinces, the high priest convinces him to give Israel autonomy, for them to worship the God of Israel, and in return for them having allegiance to him and to this pan-Hellenic organization they come up with. I kind of think of it almost like, it reminds me of the League of Nations. They keep their ability to rule locally, but they have to pay taxes to Alexander, and they have to supply men for the armies to Alexander. We read in Daniel 11, starting in verse 3, "And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out to the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, or according to the authority which he wielded. But for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them." So next, Alexander goes into Egypt and defeats Darius there. This is quite a battle, because Darius and his Persian army outnumbers him 20-1. But they're such a powerful fighting force. People just can't get to them. They just keep winning battle after battle. They then go through Afghanistan into India. They win every battle that they have, and his troops that become weary after a decade of fighting, nonstop battle. So Alexander returns to his Persian capital, and after a hard night of drinking, becomes ill and dies at the age of 33. They never rule out poisoning. The date's 323 BC. He streaks through the world like a bolt of lightning and completely changes the known face of the earth, in that area. He establishes dozens of Greek cities. He fills them with Greek traders and soldiers, and fills them with Greek culture and language. Now, when Alexander dies, his kingdom is divided up into 4 regions and given to his 4 generals: Lysimachus, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Seleucus. And the passage that we just read in Daniel is so accurate that secular historians have a difficult time believing that it was written almost 200 years before the events. The impact of many of those old civilizations, Persia, Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt, on the modern world are minor, but the impact of Greece can scarcely be overestimated. Although Alexander was Macedonian, he wanted to be a learned and cultured man. So he was not only tutored by Aristotle, but he took him with him in battle. He founded a city on the Mediterranean shore, named it Alexandria. It was to become the center of world trade. They founded the Alexandria Library there, and it was the intellectual center of the world. In their city-states, power had always been in the hands of those who could debate most effectively. And this same thing it came to include, written dissertation as well. This is where they come up with the gymnasium system. Not only did the gymnasiums that they built in every one of their Greek cities have these athletic competitions, but it also housed their intellectual system and their Greek thought and culture. And it was the single most important dominator of Hellenization anywhere that they spoke Koine Greek. The Greek program was then to become the basis of the Roman education system. And unlike other cultures of the world, the Greeks and the Hebrews were marked by a very high degree of literacy. So although these other cultures have very little impact on modern day culture, the Hebrew and the Greek civilizations had a major impact because of the high degree of literacy. Of course, the Hebrews spread throughout the ancient world. In Alexandria, there were more Jews than there were in Jerusalem. Of the 8 million Jews in the world at the time, 7 million of them lived in Greek cities. During the time of the exile in Babylon, the Jewish people, being apart from the temple, refashioned their religious belief system, and it shifted from a temple worship to a synagogue worship and their yeshiva schools, and that's where the Torah was taught and so forth. The Jews in the diaspora that were spread throughout the world were much different than the Jews that lived in Jerusalem. There's a quote from Michael Grant in his book From Alexandria to Cleopatra, and it says, "The Jews proved not only unassimilated, but unassimilable. That this is so proved one of the most significant turning points in Greek history." So in about 200 BC, the benevolent Ptolemaic reign over Israel came to an end, and the Seleucid Greeks defeat the Ptolemies, and they took the Mediterranean and Israel for themselves. And this is during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. The king becomes very frustrated and angry at the Jewish stubbornness to be Hellenized. And so they imposed Greek religion and custom on them by force. Of course, you know the story. This is where they spoiled the temple. They erect a statue of Zeus in the temple. They outlaw circumcision, and thousands of Jewish people are slaughtered. And of course, next we have the events of the Maccabees, and that's where we get the rededication of the temple and Hanukkah from. This fighting lasts for decades. All their armies were defeated by the soldiers' faith, their courage, through fasting and prayer and the intervening of God and the angels. And as a matter of fact, when the Maccabees prayed for the death of Antiochus, he died of a disease in 164 BC. Now, you all probably know the story. Judah takes over as high priest after his father dies, and then when Judah dies, his brother Jonathan replaces him. And when Jonathan passes away, his brother Simon replaces him both as high priest and as governor. They sparked revolt all over the Mediterranean, all the way to India. And so finally the Greeks decide to leave Israel alone. It's just too costly. And they confirm Simon as high priest, and they declare that Israel is now an ally. So when all this fighting began, Israel was this little nothing of a state around the Jerusalem area. And over this period of time of this conflict, they built a powerful military. They defeated the powerful Seleucid Greek Empire. They amassed enormous spoils of war. They regained their independence in almost all the territory going all the way back to King Solomon's day. And historians offer no explanation for this miraculous series of victories. A quote from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops says that the first Maccabees, where you read about all these victories and you read about, the Hanukkah story and what happened, that it was originally written in Hebrew, but the original has not come down to us. Instead, we have a pre-Christian Greek translation full of Hebrew idioms. Now, the Council of Yamina is generally thought to have canonized the books of the Hebrew Bible around 90 BC. And it's most certain that First Maccabees was not included as part of the canonized Bible because of, one, a lack of the Hebrew original. It survived in the Septuagint, and both Origen and Jerome, two of the greatest Christian scholars of Hebrew, expressed their certainty that it was written in Hebrew because of all the underlying Hebrew idioms. It's steadily been de-emphasized over the centuries. First as the Greek church becomes dominant, and then later as the Protestants reevaluate Scripture. It's hard to shake the suspicion Greek primicists, those who think the Greek language is, the superior language to read Scripture in, that they didn't want to include a Scripture where the God of Israel rose up in defense of Israel and defeated these evil Greeks by divine intervention. So after Simon, his son John Hyrcanus, becomes high priest, and Josephus writes about a conflict between a Sadducee priest and Hyrcanus. The Sadducee accuses him of being a bastard, and the priest convinces the king to remove his support from the Pharisees and give it to the Sadducees, who were part of the Hasmonean dynasty. That's my only joke. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. That's why they're sad, you see. So over time, the Hasmoneans and the upper classes are Hellenized, and as were the priestly sect of the Sadducees that were then put in charge of the temple. So John Hyrcanus' third son, Alexander Janus, takes the throne in 103 BC. He declares himself both high priest and king, and as you know, that's in opposition to Torah. One man can't be both. The whole thing was kind of, I'd say, muddied because of, the Maccabees. Simon did the same thing, declared himself king and high priest. So this Alexander Janus, he's the new king. Since him being both high priest and king is in opposition to Torah, you can imagine the Pharisees were in an uproar. A big rebellion takes place, and to squash it, he kills 50,000 of his fellow citizens. He takes the 600 elders and impales them on stakes, but not first, before killing all their wives and children before their eyes. The Greeks saw torture as a necessary part of controlling their people. However, there's no torture in the Old Testament. And the New Testament, the Brit says in Matthew 5 that you're supposed to love your neighbors, bless those that curse you, and do good to those that hate you. So, having now gained their independence, it was important for the ruling class to hold on to it. And power came about by gaining favor with the Greeks, who were then waning in power, and the Romans, who were waxing in power. By the last of the Hasmonean rulers, the kings of Israel were then taking Greek names, and the Sadducees and the upper class supporters were basically Grecians. The Sadducees had become notoriously corrupt. They were growing very rich off the tithes in the temple and the offerings. They vied to see who could provide the most lucrative bribes to the Romans in order to see who would rule the priesthood. It used to be done by casting lots, and God would select the high priest, and now it was done by bribery. All moral and military strength had disappeared from Israel's leaders. So then Pompey invades Israel, and the Romans agree to take over the protection of Israel. And the Sadducees become collaborators with Rome. And this yoke of the Romans became a very bitter one. They were very cruel. The Hasmoneans, who had been ruling the priesthood, then became outbid by Antipater. He was the Edomian. He was made chief minister in Israel in 47 BC, and Antipater was the father of Herod the Great. Now we're getting closer to Yeshua's time, so I'm going to hopefully try to tie some of this together. But the family of Antipater, they were forced into Judaism by the Maccabees when the Maccabees conquered Edom. Antipater was an Edomite Arab. His wife was a Nabatean Arab, so therefore Herod was not a Jew at all. The details of the lives of the Herods make it extremely clear that they were observant to Judaism in name only. They were considered foreigners appointed by Rome, and they were hated as much as the Romans were. So Antipater sends his son Herod to Rome to be educated there, and that's where he becomes friends with the ruling class sons and the sons of Caesar. And when he comes back home, he marries a Hasmonean princess to try to give him some claim to the throne. Then it's just only a question of who could grease the most pockets. And with the help of the Roman legions, he defeats Antigonus, who was the last of the Hasmonean kings. So in 42 BC, Herod becomes king. Let me back up. In 42 BC, before Herod was king, his father was poisoned by the Hasmoneans. And Herod goes into a rage, has them captured, has them executed, publicly executed. There was a huge public uproar. The Sanhedrin wanted to have a trial, but Herod came in with a large armed guard and postponed the trial. It never occurred. 5 years later, when he's appointed king, when he returns home to Jerusalem, he brings 2 Roman legions with him. That's about 10,000 men. And he has 46 of the 70 members of the Sanhedrin executed. He replaces them with his cronies. And no one should question and have any doubt that Herod Magnus had complete control over the Sanhedrin, as did his son Herod Antipas at the time of Yeshua. Herod becomes known as Herodias Magnus, Herod the Great. He has an expansive building program on the Temple Mount in Masada and Caesarea, and he rebuilds the temple, but to win favor with the people. He had complete authority. He uses it ruthlessly. He has a secret police force that's brutal. It kind of, reminds me of, Nazi Germany. They go around and do whatever they want. He also controlled the sacrificial system because he would place a lackey, somebody he could control, in the high priesthood. And if any of his appointees ever went against him, he has them executed and has them removed. Herod knew his credentials were suspect, so he marries Miriam. She's the granddaughter of Hyrcanus. And he appoints her brother, Aristobulus, as high priest. Aristobulus is only 17 at the time. He becomes very popular with the Jewish people. And Herod can see this could start a revolt. And if there's a revolt, the Romans are going to come down here and wreak havoc. So what does he do? He has him killed and has his wife killed. He was just paranoid beyond belief. Although Herod the Great married a Jew and had many wives and sons, the son that would rule at the time of Yeshua was Herod Antipas, and he was the son of Malthace, who was a Samaritan woman. So he wasn't a Jew either, not even half. So the Herods, they had no right to rule. The royal genealogy had been bent earlier by the Maccabees. As the Bible becomes reshaped by Greek language and culture, some of these details become obscured. I know, from my history in the Protestant in Protestant lines, the Baptist lines, none of this stuff, is discussed. So it becomes kind of, the lines become grayed. But I guarantee you that the Jews of the first century, they knew who came from the priestly line, and they knew who came from the royal line. So beneath the surface, there's this deep spiritual battle raging between paganism and Judaism. And of course, it didn't help that Hellenization was dominating Judea at the time, and they were worshiping, so many people were worshiping pagan gods. In Greek and Roman culture, homosexuality, promiscuity, adultery, pedophilia, those were the norm. Bloody torture and thrill killing, sexual perversion, all these things were legal. So the Jews were united in their hatred against both the Herods and the Romans. And their impetus, their reason to revolt was not only against Rome, but also against Herod and Herodian rule. So in 70 AD, the Romans showed their willingness to use power to stop any kind of uprising. They destroyed the temple. They enslaved thousands. The Jews rebel again in 135 AD, and this time Rome destroys all of Jerusalem. They leave 500,000 people dead in the streets, and then they salt the land so nothing will grow. Jews are crucified at random all over the countryside, and then many more were sent to the four corners of the earth. In more than a century of war, Rome had killed the same proportion of Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. 1 out of every 3 Jews was killed. It was even against Roman law to say the name of God in Judea, and that was punishable by death. So revolt was sparked by Herod, who was just the epitome of evil and madness. And he was ready to, do whatever it took to keep the Romans to come in from enforcing their tyranny. So in the days to come, the temple priesthood is going to sink to its lowest level of corruption under the ruling of Ananias and Caiaphas, who were collaborators with Rome. So Jerusalem and the temple would would be destroyed, and the Jewish people massacred and sent into slavery. So getting into Yeshua, when he was seized and taken by the temple guards, Annas was the president of the Sanhedrin, and he was former high priest, but he had been removed in 15 AD by the Roman government because he had imposed capital punishment, and of course the Jewish leaders didn't have that authority. But make no mistake, he was still the power behind the priestly throne, first through his son-in-law Caiaphas, who was also his nephew, and then through all 5 of his sons, who all 5 became high priests. So after Caiaphas came Ananias, who convinced the Romans to then put Paul into prison, and he engineers the stoning of James, Yeshua's brother and leader of the Jerusalem Messianic congregation. So looking at some scriptures in Matthew 26, starting in verse 3, the chief priests and elders of the people were gathered together in the court of the high priest named Caiaphas, and they plotted to seize Yeshua by stealth and kill him. I think you'll see that as you read these scriptures now, having kind of gone through this history and knowing the conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the corrupt high priesthood, maybe the light bulb will kind of glow a little brighter. In John 11, starting in 47, it says, "Therefore the chief priests and Pharisees convened a council and were saying, 'What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come down and take away both our place and our nation.' But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest, said, 'You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish.'" He didn't say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Yeshua was going to die for the nation. And not only for the nation, but in order that he might gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned to kill him. I'd like to emphasize that from one verse I said that if we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. There was a great multitude. Many of the common people believed he was who he said he was, and were becoming his students and following after his words. So after Annas, Yeshua is taken to Caiaphas, and in Mark 14, in verse 53, he says, "They led Yeshua away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together." In Mark 14, it says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One," and Yeshua said, "Ehie, I am." At this, the high priest rents his garments, and he condemns Yeshua to death for blasphemy. Of course, a judgment they had no authority to make. In Matthew 27, in verse 2, it says they bound him, they led him away, and delivered him to Pilate, the governor. Of course, Pilate was reluctant to crucify him because he didn't see that he had done anything worthy of that. So in Matthew 27, verse 20, it says, "But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Yeshua to death." So after this, Pilate then scourges Yeshua. He takes the 40 lashes. So in John 19, it says in verse 6, so then the chief priest and the officers saw him and cried out, "Crucify, crucify." So Pilate says, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." This was all part of the plot. You know, they had been, the crowd was stacked with members of the Sanhedrin who had been seeking his death for some period of time. Also present were the feared members of his secret police. And they were there to control the crowd and coerce any other Jews present to fall in line and do as they said. Herod and his priests knew that they had to put on a show to get Pilate to take responsibility for crucifying Yeshua. So Yeshua's shuffled back and forth a couple times. In John 19, starting in verse 12, it says, as a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, about the 6th hour. And he said, "Behold your king." And they cried out, "Away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said, "Should I crucify your king?" And the chief priests said, "We have no king but Caesar." Now, this crowd was not a crowd of the common people, nor even the Pharisees. The Pharisees hated Roman rule. They would have choked on the phrase, "We have no king but Caesar." These are Herodians, people loyal to Herod, intent on keeping their power, their empire, and condemning Yeshua to death. So anytime someone says the Jews killed Jesus, no, it was a select few of the Jewish leadership, the ruling leadership, that killed Yeshua. In Luke 23, verse 12, it starts out saying, "Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that day, for before they had been enemies. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, 'You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, I have examined him and have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges you make against him.'" It goes on to say in verse 23, "But they were insistent with loud voices that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced a sentence that their demand be granted." In Matthew 27, verse 24, it says, "Then when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and he washed his hands before the crowd and said, 'I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves.' And all the people said, 'His blood shall be on us and on our children.'" Now, I doubt that even the most Hellenized Jew and Sadducee would bring down this curse on themselves. I believe this was Herod's thugs that were sent in to fill out the crowd who said this. So again, when people tell you that the Jews killed Jesus, I think it's important to have a full understanding of this conflict. And it doesn't just end there. In the decades and centuries after the crucifixion, as then the word starts going out to all the four corners of the earth and to these Greek-speaking nations, they start interpreting it through Greek culture and through Greek eyes. I think of passage it's in John chapter 5, where it talks about this festival, this Pesach festival. You know, no, it wasn't Pesach. It was
Sukkot. No.
But give me a second, it'll come to me. But they instead of naming which of the festivals that it was the Feast of Weeks. So they didn't know what that was, so they just wrote in there, "Oh, it's a festival of the Jews." Well, that's because it's being interpreted by people that were Grecian. You know, they were Greeks. They weren't looking at it through they were looking at it through a Greek lens, not through a Hebrew lens. So that continued to come down through all of the interpretations of the Bible that we continue to read to this day. So it's helpful to sort of have an understanding of what transpired in those days. So again, just a little history lesson on what transpired prior to the crucifixion and the resurrection. And I think it helps us sort of see the big picture that exactly who killed Yeshua and why they killed him. But we all know it was part of God's plan, and one day He's going to return and make all things right. So thank you very much.
Amen.